Let's get to Papa Noam.
All right,
Yeah, let's do it. And guys, just to remind you again, this was a pre-recorded interview. It happened on Tuesday, so it happened before the rioters stormed into the Capitol building. So if you're wondering why we didn't ask any questions about the Capitol rioters, it's because it didn't happen before we had interviewed him. But with that said, enjoy the interview. We won't be coming back after the interview. This is to close out the show, but it was about an hour long, and it was, in my opinion, fantastic. It was one of my favorite interviews on this show. So enjoy.
Thanks, everyone.
Joining us now is Professor Noam Chomsky, public intellectual, linguist, and author of many books, including one of the most famous books, Manufacturing Consent. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us today.
Delighted to be with you.
I wanted to start off by asking you to reflect on our current political moment. In 2020, there were historic uprisings, civil unrest in the country in response to police brutality, and I believe income and wealth inequality as well. You also have a situation in which people are experiencing a health and economic crisis that has not been alleviated appropriately by our lawmakers. There was a huge debate about $2,000 direct checks to Americans, and our lawmakers failed to provide that at a time when so many Americans are desperate to put food on the table, keep a roof over their heads, and pay their rent. And so I wanted to ask you why it is that following so much public support for certain policies, Congress continuously tells the American people that they will not deliver, and they do so unapologetically. Why do you feel that is?
Well, one place to look always is, where's the money? Who funds Congress? Actually, there's a very fine, careful study of this by the leading scholar who deals with funding issues in politics, Thomas Ferguson. He and his colleagues did a study about a year ago, careful study in which they investigated a simple question. What's the correlation over the years, many years, between campaign funding and electability to Congress? It's almost a straight line. It's the kind of close correlation that you rarely get in the social sciences. Greater the funding, higher the electability. You can find a few cases here and there that aren't right on the line, but it's, from the standpoint of social science, it's a remarkable correlation. And in fact, we all know what happens when a congressional representative gets elected. First day in office, they start making phone calls to the potential donors for the next election coming up. Meanwhile, hordes of corporate lobbyists descend on their offices. They often have good staff people, often young kids, totally overwhelmed by the resources, the wealth, the power of the massive lobbyists who pour in. Out of that comes legislation, which the representative later signs, maybe even looks at occasionally, if he can get off the phone to the donors. What do you think? What kind of system do you expect to emerge from this? Well, we have good studies of it. So, for example, one recent, quite high-level study found that the lower, they analyzed by income as compared with decisions by their own representatives. For about 90% of the population, there's essentially no correlation. That is, they're fundamentally unrepresented. This extends earlier work by Martin Gillens, by Benjamin Page, and others who found pretty similar results. This happens to be a little more detailed and sophisticated. But the general picture is clear. The working class, most of the middle class, are basically unrepresented. the decisions reflect a very highly concentrated amount campaign money, not just campaign funding, shows up in all sorts of other ways. I mean, if you're a congressional representative and you're going to leave Congress one of these days, either by decision or because you voted out, where do you go? Do you become a truck driver, a secretary? Just take a look. Well, you know where you go, and you know what the reasons are. If you voted the right way, you got a cushy future ahead of you. There are many, many devices by which you can ensure that the large majority of the population is unrepresented, and furthermore, robbed massively. I mean, the scale is colossal. We have plenty of information about this. The Rand Corporation, ultra respectable, a couple of months ago did a study of what they call the transfer of wealth, or accurately, the robbery of the public since the neoliberal assault began in around 1980, last 40 years. How much wealth has been transferred from the working class and the middle class? They use the same 90% figure, the lower 90% of the income scale, from them to the very top. And the very top actually means fraction of 1%. Their estimate is $47 trillion. It's not small change. And it's a vast underestimate. When Reagan opened the spigots for corporate robbery, it's called neoliberalism, many devices were opened. For example, tax havens, shell companies, illegal before that, and the Treasury Company Department enforced the law. How much money was stolen that way? That's mostly secret. Private tyrannies don't let us know what they're doing. But there are some reasonable estimates. Actually, there's a IMF study that came out recently that estimated it maybe in the neighborhood of $35 trillion, roughly, just tax havens over 40 years. Well, keep adding this up. It's not pennies. And it affects people's lives. People are angry, they're resentful, very good reasons, perfect terrain for a demagogue to come along, Trump style, very effective, holds up a banner with one hand saying, I love you, I'm going to save you. Other hand stabs you in the back to pay off the rich and powerful. That's what we've been seeing. Trump's an extreme example. The Democratic National Committee is not that different. Different, but not that different. In the same game, essentially. So getting back to your question, I think these are the answers.
And I guess what I would follow with is, because the Bernie campaign for president, both of his actually were kind of like a sort of organizing principle for those of us on the left for a while. And since his defeat in what was a pretty remarkable coordinated effort from the sort of Democratic establishment, the liberal establishment, has left us with a feeling that there is no kind of next guiding principle. I think you're seeing kind of a disorganized and inchoate left in a way. Where should those of us on the left direct our energies to address these immense problems which you just outlined? You know, the trillions of dollars on offshore accounts, the wholesale purchase of Congress by the business class. Like, where should we try to direct our efforts to fight back?
Well, the first thing we should remember is that the Sanders campaign was a remarkable success. I mean, within a couple of years, Sanders and others working with him or alongside him have managed to shift the range of issues and concerns that are at the center of attention very far towards the progressive side. That's quite significant. They did it with no funding, no corporate support, no media support. Actually, the media became mildly friendly to Sanders after he had lost the nomination. not before. Before it was kind of like what happened to Corbyn in England, maybe not that extreme, but something similar. Powerful forces determined to ensure that nothing will go to the left of the most mild social democracy. In fact, if you take a look at, looking back at the success of his campaign, I think one answer to your question is keep at it. You can do a lot more of that. Remember, there was a terrible mistake that was made when Obama was elected. Namely, a lot of the left believed him, which was always a terrible error. Obama had a tremendous amount of popular support, especially from young people, lots of young activists and organizers working to get him elected. The day after the election, what happened? They told him to go home. And unfortunately, they went home. We've got our man in the office. Now I'll have faith in the pretty rhetoric, so we'll go home. So the first thing he did was stab him in the back, of course, and betray them. And within 2 years, he had completely betrayed his constituency, and it showed up in the 2010 election. Lost. It's not that the right wing won the labor vote. The Democrats lost it for good reasons. In the Kennedy replacement election in Massachusetts, liberal state, 2010, even union voters didn't vote for the Democratic candidate. They saw what Obama had done. Okay. Well, we shouldn't make that mistake again. Certainly not with Biden. Biden is kind of a weak read, in my opinion. He can be pressed. The important part of the Biden administration, first of all, there are some quite good people in it, especially among the economic advisors, but they can be pressed. We saw it on some of the most important things. So take climate change. There isn't any more important issue. If we don't deal with the environmental catastrophe soon, everything else is moot. There won't be anything to talk about. A few decades, maybe not much more. A lot of pressure on the Biden-Harris campaign from Sunrise Movement, others, did manage to press their program toward the progressive side. Not far enough, but still the best program that's ever been produced. Not bad. That meant you could go further. The DNC started hacking away at it. It was pretty striking to watch what happened. I don't have inside information, so can only speculate from what you can see. But what you can see is, and I was looking at it regularly because I was giving lots of talks on and interviews on the election. I kept looking at the Democratic program on the web up through August. It prevented, when you Googled the Democratic Party climate program, you got the Biden-Harris program. The last time I saw it was August 22nd. Next time I looked, a couple of days later, wasn't there. What you got is how to donate to the DNC. Well, we can guess what happened. I can only speculate. But I think that's the struggle that's going on. And it could continue if the left doesn't make the Obama mistake and believe those who are in power and their pretty words. The same is true of the corporate sector, incidentally, which is running scared. They're concerned with what they call reputational risks, meaning peasants are coming with the pitchforks. So all across the corporate world, you saw it at Davos, you saw it in the Business Roundtable group of corporate executives. There's discussions of how we have to confess to the public that we've done the wrong things. We haven't paid enough attention to the stakeholders, workforce, community. But now we realize our errors. Now we've overcome them. Now we're humane and dedicated to everyone. Now we're becoming what in the 1950s was called soulful corporations. really dedicated to the common good. Forget all this business about making money. That's just on the side. So now we have lots of soulful corporations appealing to the public on their great humanity, sometimes taking measures like withdrawing funding from fossil fuel companies and so on. They can be pressed. Now, I don't like the system. You don't like the system, but it exists. Okay? And we have to work within it to change it. We can't say, I don't want it. Let's have another system that doesn't exist. And it can be done by pressure from inside and from outside. So, for example, there's no reason to avoid working to try to create an alternative political framework and social framework that ranges from a new party, true left party, to actions in the economy like taking over, creating worker-owned enterprises and cooperatives and all, localism in agriculture, all sorts of things. There's a whole array of options open to us, and they all have to be pursued.
So I can ask you 28 questions based on the answer you just gave right now. So many interesting points to touch on, but I'll stick to the theme of what the left should focus its energies on, because I agree with you in that Bernie Sanders was certainly incredibly successful in waking people up so they think about politics in terms of with class consciousness, which I think was really missing from the mindset of the electorate previously. He also did spark quite a bit of anger because realizing just how much the system is rigged against the average American infuriates people. And that anger and rage is now, I think, metastasizing during this pandemic as Americans, do not get the real financial relief that they desperately need. But what I find interesting is that the response from our congressional lawmakers, including Democrats, has been so incredibly defiant. You have people at this point vandalizing, the homes of Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi as a result of their unwillingness to do the right thing for the American people. And this isn't a question about morality. This is really about power. Who holds power in the country and who wields it and who can actually use it to their advantage. What I'm seeing among the left right now is a willingness to engage in mass protests, a willingness to confront politicians and do so militantly, but it happens sporadically and it happens in an unorganized way. And so I wanted to ask you, how do we effectively organize, especially at a time when it seems like there is some emerging disagreement among leftists as to whether or not organizing has been productive or successful? I think people are getting incredibly impatient with the lack of influence toward our congressional lawmakers. So I wanted you to share your thoughts on that.
Well, the lack of influence goes back in the United States, roughly 250 years. And so we can start with the Constitution, which was established explicitly on the principle of preventing democracy. There wasn't any secret about it. I'm quite open about it. In fact, the major scholarly study, the gold standard for scholarship on the Constitutional Convention, Michael Klarman, Harvard Law professor, is called The Framers' Coup, the coup against democracy by the framers. It goes in detail. It's not a radical point of view, it just goes through the hundreds of pages of details of the discussions, comes out very clearly. The theme of the founders basically was expressed quite well by John Jay, who was first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He said, those who own the country ought to govern it. That's what we see today in the matters we were just discussing. Those who own the country have succeeded in governing it, okay? It hasn't been a uniform procedure. There have been plenty of resistance, and lots of victories have been won. So my childhood, for example, 1930s, there were major victories mainly spearheaded by the organized labor movement, CIO organizing, militant strikes, militant labor actions, moderately sympathetic administration, a lot of political activism of all sorts. Some good things happened. U.S. moved towards moderate social democracy. We're still enjoying some of the benefits of that. A lot of it's been chipped away. Well, no reason why that can't. And there are other periods of American history that are similar. The late 19th century, the most radical popular movements in U.S. history developed. Knights of Labor, the populist movement has nothing to do with what's called populism today. Radical farmers, they were getting together, a major movement, finally crushed by force, state corporate force, but with a residue. This is fundamentally a class struggle that goes on through history, and we're in a particular stage of it. Well, to say we're disappointed because we haven't succeeded is like saying we're in the world. Yes, we keep struggling, make improvements, some regression, keep going. Slavery was overcome, and after hundreds of years of struggle, then it came back in another form. It's still, the residue's still there, but it's not that there's no victory at all. There are. Things are better than they were because of constant struggle. In fact, this country is a lot better than it was 50 years, 60 years ago, mainly because of the activism of the 60s. Just remember what the country was in the 1960s. I mean, the country had anti-miscegenation laws so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them because they were too extreme. Federal funded housing by law barred Afro-Americans, not because the liberal senators wanted that, but because you couldn't get anything through the Southern Democratic stranglehold on policy. Social Security was designed to exclude Afro-Americans, domestic workers, agricultural workers. I mean, there were anti-sodomy laws into this century. Lots of things have changed. Not easy, but if you say, well, we haven't gotten where we wanted, I'm going to quit, you just guarantee that the worst is going to happen. It's a constant struggle, and it can be done at every level. As I said, take say, Tony Mazzocchi, one of the heroes of modern labor and environmentalism, head of the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union, one of the first serious environmentalists in the country. His constituents are right at the front line, being murdered by pollution, destruction of the environment, and so on. This is the early 70s, way before the environmental movement took off. His union, under his leadership, was working very strongly to move towards dealing with the environmental crisis. Moved on to try to establish a labor party in the 90s. It could have worked, didn't make it. The neoliberal assault, beginning with Reagan on through Clinton, Obama, was designed to destroy labor. Every step of the way, moves were made to undermine the labor movement. It was explicit. Reagan's campaign opened with an attack on the labor unions, even bringing in scabs to destroy strikes. Corporations quickly picked it up. Thatcher did exactly the same thing in England. The people behind the neoliberal assault understood what they were doing. You have to eliminate the ability of laboring people to defend themselves if you want to crush them the way it's been done. So that was the first step. It's been quite successful. Clinton extended it. His neoliberal globalization policies were designed to protect investors and to crush labor, and they did it. And that has to be, that's similar to the 30s. In the 1920s, labor had been virtually crushed. The U.S. has a very violent labor history, much worse than comparable countries. It's a business-run society to an unusual extent. There was a militant, successful labor movement, early part of the 20th century, after Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare was almost destroyed. 1920s, there was almost nothing there. Came roaring back in the 30s. That's what led to the New Deal policies, the mild social democracy that we still benefit from. Well, that can be done again. In fact, it's beginning to happen in quite interesting ways. So labor had been so crushed by the neoliberal policies that there barely were any strikes. Workers were afraid to go on strike. They'd be destroyed. It started to pick up in red states, ununionized labor. Teachers in West Virginia and Arizona, enormous public support. I'm in Arizona. When the teachers began to strike, there was popular support all over the place. You look all over lawns, there's, posters saying, support the teachers, And they weren't just calling for higher salaries, which they very much deserve, but calling for improving the educational system, which has been very harshly hit by the neoliberal plague. One part of it has been aimed at the educational system. Privatization, defunding, regimentation, teaching to test, all of these things. Bipartisan. I mean, Republicans are more extreme, so Betty DeVos was almost openly devoted to destroying the whole system. Doesn't have to be that bad, but Obama's policies weren't much better if you want to look at them. It's here's the teacher strike, lots of popular support, nurses strikes, service unions, sometimes ununionized, sometimes opposed by the unions, but taking off. It's affected other elements of the working class. Big GM strike, more of that could happen. The destruction of labor has been a major factor in the extreme inequality. There's some mainstream economists like Lawrence Summers who've concluded that it's the major factor in the extreme inequality, just taking away the ability of workers to defend themselves. Certainly a major factor. That can come back. Alternative political parties like Mazzocchi's could come back. Pressure on the Democrats to move to the left, like the kind of thing that Ocasio-Cortez squad, others are doing, that can have an effect. It's got to have a lot of popular action behind it. If the troops go home, say, I'm disappointed I didn't get what I wanted, it's going to move to the right. There's one force that's relentless. They never stop. The business classes are Marxists, dedicated Marxists. They're fighting a vicious class war all the time. They never stop. If they have an opportunity, they'll move ahead. If the rest of the population leaves the struggle, you know what's going to happen. In fact, we've seen 40 years of it.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask a little bit about that class struggle because, Piketty, for example, has pointed out that across the Western democracies, and it's happened here in the United States, certainly the class composition of the parties has been shifting pretty in striking ways. We've seen this kind of phenomenon of the so-called Never Trump Republicans flocking to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party's base shifting toward these kind of more upper middle class suburban voters, whereas the Republicans still don't win working class voters, but are certainly making inroads in the working class in ways that they hadn't in the past. What do you make of that phenomenon that's happened here in the United States, but also in Europe, where these sort of traditional left-wing parties are becoming parties more and more of the sort of educated elites and the sort of working class is getting shut out, basically?
Well, let's start with the United States. There is something similar in Europe. So by the late 1970s, late Carter years, the Democrats basically told the working class, we don't have any interest in you. Started in the late 70s. The last gasp of pro-labor activity in the Democratic Party was the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act in, I think, 1978. Carter didn't veto it, but he watered it down so that it was toothless. It was left voluntary. Okay, meaning nice words, but you don't do anything about it. From that point on, the Democrats essentially abandoned the working class. A few gestures here and there. When Clinton came, take a look at NAFTA. And NAFTA was rammed through in secret over the objections of the labor movement. They weren't even informed until the last minute of what the framework was, investor rights agreement. Actually, they came out at the last minute. The Labor Advisory Council did come out with an alternative program for NAFTA. Say, here's a much better way to do it. Your version, the executive version, is going to lead to a low growth, low wage economy. Here's a way to do it with a high growth, high wage economy. Happened that their program was almost the same as that of the Congress's own research agency, the Office of Technology Assessment. Congress at that time did have a research agency. Congress decided they don't want to be bothered by stuff like information, so they destroyed it a couple of years later, but it used to be around. But the OTAP program and the LAC program, Labor Advisory Committee, were quite similar. Nobody paid attention to them, never reported. The executive branch didn't care. They wanted their version of NAFTA, which was perfectly clear in advance that you have an arrangement that's basically an investor rights agreement that sets working people in competition with each other without rights. You can tell what's going to happen, and it did. In fact, worse than what was expected. Turned out that under Clinton's NAFTA, corporations were able to use to break organizing efforts at a very high level. About 50% of them were broken simply by threats to move the enterprise to Mexico. If the threats weren't serious, they weren't going to do it, but the threat is enough to break the organizing effort. Happens to be illegal, but when you have a criminal state, you can carry out illegal acts. So they were carried out very effectively. There's a good study of this under NAFTA rules, actually, by Kate Bronfenbrenner, labor economist at Cornell, and found that what I just described, that about 50% of organizing efforts were broken illegally just by threats to move the enterprise. So that's only one example. But labor has just been smashed by the Democrats. So, well, I told you what happened in 2008. You know it yourself. But 2008, labor voted for Obama. 2010, gone. They had seen what the promises meant. Remember what happened then. This was the midst of a financial crisis, huge financial crisis caused by the collapse of the housing market. Congress under Bush, in fact, had passed legislation, TARP legislation, to do something about it. The legislation had two components. One was to bail out the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks who had caused the crisis with predatory lending practices and other devious semi-criminal actions. So you have to bail them out. The other part of the legislation was to bail out the victims, people who had lost their homes under foreclosures, lost their jobs, do something for them. Anybody who knows American history and politics could have predicted which half of the legislation was going to be implemented by President Obama. Well, maybe workers didn't know all the details, but they could see it in their lives. Within 2 years, the working class had large parts of it, even the unionized working class, had said, this party isn't working for us. They're our enemy. Where can you go? You can go to the guys who claim that they're going to bring back traditional America or get you jobs. They're not going to do it, of course, but they at least claim to. You take a look at Trump voters. They've been carefully studied. A lot of them say, yeah, we know he's a jerk. He's not going to do anything. But at least he says that he likes us. Okay? He stands up and says, I'm with you. I'm one of you guys. I act like you. It's like George Bush, W. Bush. You may recall that on every weekend he would go off to his to Texas and his farm and be filmed cutting brush on 100 degrees temperature to show he's a real ordinary guy, you know. After he left office, I don't think he ever went back there.
Right. Yeah, that's such a good point.
Put on this act, you know, I'm one of you guys. Sometimes it's comical. Remember John Kerry, when he was running, decided to show he's an ordinary guy, so he went windsurfing.
Yeah.
That won a lot.
Yeah, one of the other examples was Mitt Romney in 2012, who wanted to brag about his Costco button-down T-shirts. So that kind of theater definitely takes place to pander to working Americans. But I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you. Did you want to finish your point?
Well, let me just say that the Trump voters, if you look at them, the most careful studies I've seen are those of Tony DiMaggio, a very good social scientist, is left social scientist, and a lot of books and articles. But he did recent analysis on what's known so far about the 2020 Trump voters. And it looks like, once again, the core, apart from the evangelicals, you know, the white supremacists, apart from those sectors, the main voting base for Trump is basically petty bourgeois. Incomes from $100,000 to $200,000, way beyond the median. That's not working people. Small businessmen, insurance salesmen, and so on. That seems to be the main base, and even greater than in 2016. It seems to have increased. The only part that increased substantially. A lot of working people think, well, at least he says something nice to us. Democrats don't do anything. Actually, we saw this dramatically in some of the areas that there's been a lot of lament about. So take, say, South Texas. There's been a lot of study of why South Texas, which hadn't voted for a Republican for 100 years, since Harding, moved towards Trump. These are Mexican-American communities. How come they broke with 100 years of voting Democrat? Well, you take a close look, you can see why. First of all, the Democrats didn't make the slightest effort to do any organizing. They're Hispanics, they vote for us. People don't like that, you know, but there was a more serious reason. These are oil-producing areas. All that they heard was Biden wants to take away our jobs, destroy our families, destroy our economies, because a bunch of pointy-headed rich liberals claim there's a climate crisis. Okay? If the Democrats cared at all about working people, they would have been down there saying, look, there's a climate crisis. We are going to have to transition away from fossil fuels, period. You don't do that, nothing's going to be left. But you can have better jobs, better lives, better economy by moving towards working on changing the industries, maybe under your own control, to sustainable energy and constructive development, like mass transportation instead of traffic jams, lots of other things. That's what organizers do, okay? They didn't bother. Working class is not their constituency. So they voted for the guy who says, I'm going to bring your jobs back.
There's this ongoing there's this ongoing debate about whether or not the Republican Party can be legitimately and sincerely become the party of the working class. This debate about right-wing populism. And I would really love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think it's important to push back against that idea, especially when you consider the material interests at play. But I am seeing right-wingers on media, like Tucker Carlson, for instance, who seems to pander to the frustrations that so many Americans are feeling in the corporate world. But I mean, when push comes to shove, I'm very skeptical that he genuinely cares about workers or changing the system to make it a little more equal for people who don't have as much power as executives in these corporations. But I wanted to hear your thoughts. Is it possible for the working class to work together regardless of their overall political ideology, whether they're on the right or the left?
Well, first of all, they have to have something to vote for. If the Democrats say, we don't care about you, now we're the party of Wall Street and rich professionals, we have Hollywood stars at our events, and who cares about you? Yeah, they'll vote for the guy who's, I like you, I act like you, I hate the elites. Vote for that guy, even if he's not doing anything for them, and in fact screwing them. If you want to look at these Republicans who claim to be pro-working class, take a look at how they vote. So take a look at how they voted on the one legislative achievement of the Trump administration, the tax scam, which gave a huge amount of money to the very rich and is stabbing the working class in the back. How'd they vote on that? How do they vote on the way the CARES program was administrated, so that it goes to banks who then decide how to distribute it, and they give it to their rich clients. So billionaires are making out like pirates. It's amazing. They're doing great. So ask how they voted on that. Now take a look at the actual legislative actions. It's very easy to get up and say, I'm for the workers, easy. If nobody else is saying anything else, maybe people will say, well, at least he says he likes us. Unless there's an alternative, the votes don't mean anything. People are voting just out of frustration if they vote at all. Remember, almost half the population doesn't even bother. So unless there's a constructive alternative, people aren't going to join. And there can be. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you look at the United States. Take a look at the liberal press, the most liberal commentators, people I like actually, writing about the Sanders campaign. They said his proposals are very good, but they're too radical for the American people. We've got to be more mild. We can't be that radical. What are the proposals that are too radical? Well, take a look at Sanders's, the programs he highlighted. Top one, universal medical care. Do you know of any other country that has universal medical care? I mean, can you think of a country that doesn't have it? One of the chief correspondents of the London Financial Times, Rana Forahar, she's associate editor, a very good columnist, wrote a column in which, sort of half-jokingly, she said that if Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the Christian Democrat program, the right-wing party. Of course, they're in favor of universal health care. Who isn't? The other program is free higher education. Again, you find it almost everywhere. The most high-performing countries, Finland, others, sure, Europe, Mexico, it's all over the place. That's too radical for the American people. I mean, that's an insult to the American population that's hard to find words to express. That's coming from the left end of the mainstream spectrum. Well, the left, the authentic left, ought to be able to break through that. They ought to be able to break through and say that Sanders's programs, it wouldn't have much surprised Eisenhower. Eisenhower was strongly pro-New Deal. His position was anyone who questions the New Deal doesn't belong in the American political system. I mean, under the neoliberal years, things have moved so far to the right at the elite level, at the power level, that it's hard to remember what was normal not long before. Well, these are tasks for the left. You can reach people with that. You can reach people with reviving the labor movement, moving towards a Labor Party, pressing the liberal part of the Democratic Party towards moderately social democratic ends, particularly on things like climate. Should also mention nuclear weapons. It's not talked about. It's a major threat to our existence. The threat is increasing enormously. One of Trump's many crimes was to dismantle the whole arms control system and initiate moves towards creating very dangerous new weapon systems. That has to be terminated quickly, or we're in serious trouble. That can be done. All of these things can be done. There's plenty of options open. I don't think there's a shortage of causes to engage in actively. Problem is the will to do it. You mentioned getting the various segments of the left together. You have to get together on these things. You can differ on other things, but there are some major things that are just essential for, literally for human survival. And yes, they have to be worked on hard. And I think most of the population is ready for them.
And, talking about climate change as this existential threat, which I think we all agree that it is. I think that it's when I think about it, and I think about, we live under capitalism, market society, profit-driven society. It just seems like we won't be able to truly fix the climate problem until we move beyond capitalism in some way, which traditionally we've called basically socialism. Like, do you think it's still useful to think about it in those terms as a sort of political horizon?
It's useful, but there's some facts we have to remember. One of them is time scale. We have a decade or two to deal decisively with the environmental crisis. We're not going to overthrow capitalism in a couple of decades. I think that doesn't mean you stop working for it. You can continue working for it, but recognizing that the solution is going to have to come within some kind of regimented capitalist system, not the neoliberal system. There are a variety of kinds of capitalism. So you go back to the pre-neoliberal period, this period of so-called regimented capitalism, very different from this. And within that framework of serious government control of the destructive excesses of unleashed capitalism, you have a chance to proceed. Meanwhile, you should be doing exactly what you said, trying to undermine these. And again, I think people can understand it. You take the fundamental evil of capitalism, which was always understood by traditional socialists, namely the fact that you have to have a job. We consider having a job a wonderful thing. Working people in the early industrial revolution regarded it as an obscenity, a fundamental attack on essential human rights and dignity. And that was such a strong position that it was a slogan of the Republican Party under Lincoln, that wage labor differs from slavery only in that it's temporary till you can become a free person. Well, that can be implemented by worker control of the enterprises in which they are part. You're not going to get it in, actually you can't even get it in one step, like worker-owned enterprises, which are proliferating. But you can get it by a series of steps, like even which have been proposed, like Warren and Sanders proposed worker representation on the corporate managing boards. It's not very radical. Germany has it, for example, conservative country. But it gives you some step forward. You can move forward beyond that with actual direct action on the ground, like, for example, worker-owned enterprises, to changing the nature of the way in which the capitalist system works. You have a carbon tax. Don't do it. They did it in France, Macron, which led to the Yellow Vest movement. A carbon tax which hits the working class, designed to hit the working class. Yeah, you do that, you're going to get an uprising. You can have a carbon tax in which the revenue is returned to the public in a progressive manner. Then it benefits the working class. Yes, you pay a little more for gas, but you get more in return. Same with healthcare. It'd save a huge amount of money if we had a universal healthcare system, but you are going to pay higher taxes. And you'll save twice that much on your insurance premiums. So you have to get that to people. Okay? Those are the tasks for the left. Educational, organizational, activist. I think there's a tremendous range of opportunities available. But it's not enough to know what to do. You have to do it.
Yeah. Wow.
Professor Chomsky, we're going to have to wrap up the interview pretty soon, but I wanted to make sure to give you a note because it's important. First of all, I don't know how people like you, who's experienced so much, including being banned from legacy media publications for your opinions, can remain fighter, someone who's optimistic. You seem to still be pretty optimistic about what can be accomplished in the future. But I wanted to give you a note from one of my journalism students who in the past semester was required in my class to read Manufacturing Consent. And after the class was over, he sent me an email saying that, you know, this is an upper division journalism class, so he's going to graduate soon. And he felt pretty disconnected from this line of work and felt that, you know, he wasn't excited about it. He saw that, you know, journalists really just read from a script or, you know, do what their editors tell them to do. But reading your book lit a fire within him. And all of a sudden he has this passion for journalism that he didn't feel before. So I just wanted to, you know, give you my wholehearted appreciation for the work that you've done, not just in Manufacturing Consent, but for challenging people's preconceived notions and encouraging them to continue to fight for a more just society. And I'll end this with one more question to you. How do you remain optimistic that we can fight successfully for real change that benefits ordinary people?
Well, one easy way is to just look at what I see on the screen. People committed to struggling for a better world. And there are plenty of people like you. Okay? Perfectly good reason to be optimistic. I mean, I can't do it much more. I'm getting too old, but I used to travel around a lot to some of the poorest, most oppressed areas of the world. Laos, southern Colombia, Kurdish areas in Turkey, Palestinian refugee camps, most miserable places you can find. Plenty of people are optimistic. They don't give up. Incomparably worse conditions than ours. And we have opportunities they can't dream of. But they don't give up. They're struggling. You go to a poor rural community in Colombia, you know, hours away from the highway. Get to the community, the first thing you see is a small cemetery where white crosses for people who were killed in the latest paramilitary attack. Get into the town, welcome, have a meal, go to a meeting. They're talking about how to save the mountain next to them from corporate predators who'll destroy their water supply and so on. But they're struggling optimistically. I mean, you see people like that everywhere, here too. How can you not share in their optimism with all of our privileges and advantages?
Well, Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with us. We covered a lot of ground here, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Hopefully you'll come on again in the future.